The cantina on Nexus Station reeked of sulfur and desperation. Smoke from a dozen different alien narcotics created a hazy atmosphere that would have killed most oxygen-breathing species within minutes. But Zextar had long since modified his respiratory system to filter out such inconveniences. The Crothery Mercenary sat in the darkest corner of the establishment, his four crimson eyes scanning the crowd with predatory interest. At 8 feet tall and covered in chitinous armor that had evolved over millions of years, Zextar was an apex predator. His species had conquered 17 star systems before most civilizations had even discovered fire. The Crothery were born killers, engineered by evolution to be the perfect hunters. Their reputation preceded them across the galaxy. When a Crothery took a contract, the target was as good as dead. Zextar had personally eliminated over 3,000 beings across 47 different worlds. Politicians, crime bosses, rebel leaders, corrupt corporate executives, it didn't matter. Credits were credits, and death was his specialty. His success rate was 100%, a record that had earned him the title of the galaxy's most feared mercenary. The communication device on his wrist chirped with an incoming transmission. Zextar activated the holographic display, revealing the translucent blue image of a Zolonian merchant. The squid-like alien's tentacles writhed nervously as he spoke. "Zextar, I have a contract that requires your particular skills," the Zolonian said, his voice distorted by the universal translator. "The payment is substantial, 50 million galactic credits." 50 million. Even by Zextar standards, that was an impressive sum. His mandibles clicked together in what passed for interest among his species. "Continue. There's a problem with some humans that needs to be resolved," the merchant explained. "They've been interfering with certain business operations in the Outer Rim territories. Nothing too complicated, just a small family that's become rather inconvenient." Zextar's primary eyes narrowed. He had heard whispers about humans recently. They were a relatively new species that had somehow managed to spread throughout several systems despite their apparent physical limitations. Most galactic civilizations viewed them as an oddity, soft, weak creatures that somehow survived through luck and primitive cunning. "Humans," Zextar repeated, his voice carrying a note of disdain. "I've heard they're barely evolved from their primitive ancestors. Why do you need someone of my caliber for such inferior prey?" The Zolonian's tentacles twisted more frantically. "They're resourceful. Several previous attempts have failed to resolve the situation. The family has proven more resilient than expected." This intrigued Zextar. In his experience, any species that could survive multiple assassination attempts possessed some hidden capability. Perhaps these humans would provide more entertainment than his usual targets. "Tell me about them," he commanded. "The primary targets are Marcus Chun, a former military officer turned agricultural specialist, his mate Sarah Chun, who has some background in engineering, and their offspring, a male called David, approximately 16 standard years old. They've established a small settlement on Kepler 442c in the Outer Rim." Zextar accessed his databank on human physiology. The information was limited, but what he found was hardly impressive. Humans stood barely 6 feet tall on average, possessed no natural weapons like claws or venom, and had relatively short lifespans. Their physical strength was modest compared to most galactic species. Yet something had kept this family alive when others had failed to eliminate them. "What kind of previous attempts?" Zextar asked. The Zolonian hesitated before responding. "Standard operations. Hired local thugs, attempted poisoning, even sent a Morganian death squad. Each attempt has been unsuccessful." A Morganian death squad. That was more serious than Zextar had initially assumed. The Morganians were professional killers, not as skilled as the Crothery, but certainly competent enough to handle most targets. If they had failed, these humans might actually present an interesting challenge. "I accept the contract," Zextar declared. "Transfer half the payment now, with the remainder upon completion." "Excellent," the Zolonian said, relief evident in his voice. "I'll transmit the coordinates and all available intelligence. But, Zextar, be careful. There's something about these humans that's different from the others we've encountered. The transmission ended, and Zextar began reviewing the intelligence package that appeared on his display. The Chen family had established their settlement in a region of Kepler 442c that was technically uninhabited but rich in rare minerals. That explained the Zolonians' interest. The merchant probably wanted to establish mining operations without interference. The planet itself was relatively primitive, with a thin atmosphere and harsh climate. Most species would require extensive life support equipment to survive there for extended periods. Yet, according to the reports, the Chen family had not only survived, but actually thrived, building a self-sufficient agricultural operation that was beginning to attract other human settlers. Zextar studied the limited visual data on his targets. Marcus Chen appeared to be a typical human male. Average height, brown hair, unremarkable features. The intelligence reports indicated he had served in something called the Terran Colonial Marines, but human military forces were generally considered a joke among galactic civilizations. How dangerous could one former soldier really be? Sarah Chan seemed even less threatening. She was smaller than her mate, with long blonde hair and blue eyes. The reports indicated she had designed most of the settlement's infrastructure, suggesting some technical aptitude, but nothing that seemed particularly dangerous. Their offspring, David, was barely more than a child by most species standards. Human children were notoriously helpless compared to those of other civilizations. Crothery young could hunt and kill within hours of hatching. Human children apparently required years of care before becoming functional. As Zextar prepared his equipment, he considered the best approach for this contract. His usual method was to study the target's routines, identify moments of vulnerability, then strike with overwhelming force. The isolated location of the settlement would actually work in his favor. No witnesses, no local law enforcement, no complications. He packed his plasma rifle, molecular disruptor, and assorted melee weapons. For humans, such firepower was probably overkill, but Zextar had built his reputation on being thorough. He also included his stealth generator and personal shield unit. Better to be over-prepared than surprised. The journey to Kepler 442c took 3 standard days aboard his modified scout ship. During the trip, Zextar continued studying everything available about human behavior and capabilities. The more he read, the more convinced he became that the Zolonian was overreacting. Humans seemed to be skilled at survival in their natural environment, but they had evolved on a relatively peaceful world. They lacked the combat instincts that marked true predator species. Their technology was primitive compared to most galactic civilizations. They had only recently developed faster-than-light travel, and their weapons were still based on crude projectile systems rather than advanced energy weapons. Their military tactics seemed to rely more on overwhelming numbers than individual skill or superior technology. What puzzled Zextar was how such an apparently weak species had managed to spread across multiple star systems. Most successful expanding civilizations were either highly aggressive warrior cultures like his own Crothery, or possessed some significant technological advantage. Humans seemed to have neither. As his ship entered the Kepler 442 system, Zextar began conducting detailed scans of the target planet. The Chen settlement was located in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, positioned to take advantage of a small river that provided water for their agricultural operations. The location showed decent strategic thinking. It was defensible and had access to natural resources. Thermal imaging revealed the heat signatures of 3 human-sized beings moving around the settlement. Additional scans detected various technological emissions consistent with power generators, communication equipment, and what appeared to be some kind of defensive systems. The latter was interesting. Few civilian settlements invested in serious defensive measures unless they expected trouble. Zextar landed his ship approximately 20 kilometers from the settlement, using his vessel's stealth systems to avoid detection. From this distance, He could approach on foot while maintaining the element of surprise. The local terrain was rocky and provided adequate cover for someone with his training. As he gathered his gear, Zextar reflected on how routine this contract was likely to be. 3 humans, isolated on a primitive world, with no backup or support. He would observe their patterns for a day or 2, identify the optimal moment to strike, then eliminate them quickly and efficiently. With any luck, he would be off-world within a week and 50 million credits richer. The Crothery Mercenary activated his personal cloaking device and began the trek toward the Chin settlement. His enhanced senses picked up various details about the local environment. The chemical composition of the atmosphere, the mineral content of the soil, the sounds, and sense of native wildlife. Everything seemed normal for a frontier world. As he drew closer to the settlement, Zextar began to notice signs that suggested his targets were more prepared than he had expected. Hidden sensors were positioned along the approaches to the valley, disguised to look like natural rock formations. Anyone without his enhanced perception would have missed them entirely. More interesting were the defensive positions built into the landscape itself. What had initially appeared to be natural features were revealed upon closer inspection to be carefully constructed barriers and firing positions. Someone had spent considerable time and effort turning this peaceful valley into a potential fortress. When Zextar finally reached a position where he could observe the settlement directly, what he saw made him pause. The Chin family's home was not the simple prefabricated structure he had expected. Instead, it was a complex of interconnected buildings that seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural terrain. Solar collectors and wind generators provided power, while extensive gardens and livestock pens indicated a high degree of self-sufficiency. But what caught his attention most were the defensive measures. The settlement was surrounded by what appeared to be a sophisticated sensor net, with automated systems that would detect any approaching threats. Vehicle barriers and defensive walls were built into the landscape so skillfully that they were nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. Through his scope, Zextar observed the 3 family members going about their daily routines. Marcus Chun moved with the controlled precision of someone with extensive military training, constantly aware of his surroundings even while performing mundane tasks. Sarah Chun demonstrated technical skills that suggested her engineering background was more extensive than the intelligence reports had indicated. Even young David moved with a level of alertness and competence that was unusual for his age. As Zextar watched, he began to understand why previous assassination attempts had failed. This was not a family of helpless civilians. They were prepared, organized, and clearly experienced in dealing with threats. The settlement itself had been designed as both a home and a fortress, capable of defending against significant attacks. Still, they were only humans. Zextar had faced prepared opponents before. His arsenal and training should be more than sufficient to overcome whatever surprises they might have prepared. He began planning his approach, looking for weaknesses in their defenses and patterns in their behavior that he could exploit. What he didn't know was that Marcus Chun had already detected his presence. The former colonial marine had installed sensors throughout the valley that were far more sophisticated than anything in Zextar's intelligence files. At that very moment, the Chun family was implementing protocols they had developed specifically for dealing with alien assassins. The hunt was about to begin, but the roles of predator and prey were not as clear-cut as Zextar believed. Marcus Chun stood in his workshop, studying the holographic display that showed multiple red dots approaching their valley. The sensors Sarah had installed were military-grade, borrowed from his old colonial marine connections, and modified for civilian use. What they were detecting now was definitely not local wildlife. "Sarah, we've got company," he called to his wife, who was working on their communication array in the adjacent room. "Multiple contacts, but they're not moving like a group. Looks like a single infiltrator trying different approach routes." Sarah Chen entered the workshop, wiping her hands on a maintenance cloth. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her blue eyes showed the same calm focus that had made her one of the Terran Federation's best combat engineers before they had decided to try civilian life. "Same signature pattern as the Morganian team?" she asked, examining the sensor data. Marcus shook his head. "Different. This one's using some kind of advanced stealth technology. The sensors are only picking up thermal displacement and gravitational anomalies. Whoever this is better gear than anything we've seen before." David Chun appeared in the doorway, his 16-year-old frame already showing signs of the muscle development that came from life on a frontier world. Unlike most teenagers from civilized worlds, David had been raised knowing that their family was constantly under threat. His parents had trained him in survival, combat, and tactical thinking from an early age. "What's the situation?" David asked, immediately moving to help analyze the sensor data. Marcus felt a familiar surge of pride in his son. Most kids David's age would be panicking or asking questions. David had learned long ago to focus on understanding the threat first and worry about emotions later. "Single assassin, probably alien, definitely professional," Marcus summarized. "Better equipped than the previous attempts. We need to assume this one won't make the same mistakes as the others." The Chun family had been dealing with assassination attempts for over 2 years now, ever since they had established their settlement on Kepler 442c. What had started as a simple desire to live peacefully on a frontier world had somehow made them targets for various criminal organizations that wanted their land and resources. The first few attempts had been almost laughably amateur. Local thugs hired to convince them to leave had found themselves outmatched by a former colonial marine and a combat engineer. Subsequent attempts had escalated in sophistication and violence, forcing the family to transform their peaceful home into a fortress. "What species are we dealing with?" Sarah asked, continuing her analysis of the sensor data. Marcus enhanced the display, trying to extract more information from the limited readings. "Based on the movement patterns and stealth capabilities, I'd guess either Crothery or Morganian. But the Morganians already tried and failed. If this is a Crothery, we're dealing with something much more dangerous." The Crothery were legendary throughout human space as the galaxy's most effective assassins. They were apex predators that had been killing for millions of years before humans had even developed agriculture. If the people behind these attacks had escalated to hiring a Crothery, it meant they were getting desperate. "All right," Sarah said, moving to a weapons locker built into the wall. "Protocol 7. Marcus nodded. Protocol 7 was their plan for dealing with a single, highly skilled assassin. They had developed it after studying everything available about various alien hunter species, particularly the Crothery. David moved to his assigned position without needing to be told. Over the past 2 years, the family had drilled these protocols until they were second nature. Each family member knew their role, their backup positions, and their contingency plans. "Remember," Marcus said as they began implementing their defensive measures, "humans have some advantages that most aliens don't expect. We're adaptable, we think creatively, and we're willing to do things that seem irrational to species with rigid behavioral patterns." The Chun family's defensive strategy was based on a simple premise. Most alien species, particularly predator species like the Crothery, relied on predictable behavior patterns. They had evolved successful hunting strategies over millions of years, which meant they tended to approach problems in consistent ways. Humans, on the other hand, were relative newcomers to the galactic stage. Their evolutionary history was unusual compared to most sentient species. They had evolved as persistence hunters and problem solvers rather than apex predators. This gave them a flexibility that often surprised other species. Sarah activated the settlement's automated defense systems, while Marcus prepared their more creative surprises. David took position at the communication station, ready to coordinate their responses and call for help if needed. The first surprise for any attacker was that the Chun settlement looked much more vulnerable than it actually was. From a distance, it appeared to be a simple collection of agricultural buildings with minimal defenses. Only careful examination would reveal the hidden weapons emplacements, the reinforced structures, and the sophisticated sensor network that monitored the entire valley. The second surprise was that the Chun family didn't fight like typical civilians. Marcus's colonial marine training had included extensive study of alien combat tactics, while Sarah's engineering background allowed her to create weapons and defensive systems that most aliens had never encountered. David had been raised on stories of human military history and had learned to think tactically from an early age. As they monitored their unknown stalker's approach, Marcus began setting up what he privately called human solutions to alien problems. These were tactics that relied on human psychology and behavior patterns that other species often found incomprehensible. Contacts stopped moving, David reported from his sensor station. Approximately 2 kilometers out in a rock formation overlooking the southern approach. Marcus smiled grimly. That was exactly where he had expected a professional assassin to set up their observation post. It provided excellent visibility of the settlement while offering good concealment and multiple escape routes. Time to let our friend know we're aware of him, Marcus said, activating one of their more subtle defensive measures. Throughout the valley, hidden speakers began broadcasting a very quiet audio signal, so quiet that it would be barely audible even to enhanced alien hearing. The signal was a recording of human voices having a casual conversation about their daily activities. To anyone monitoring the settlement, it would sound like the family was going about their normal routine, unaware of any threat. But embedded within the conversation, in a code that only someone with military training would recognize, was a detailed tactical assessment of the assassin's position and likely capabilities. Unknown contact, probably Crothry Hunter, position Tango 7. The seemingly innocent conversation included: recommend implementation of Razor protocols. Maintain civilian facade until engagement is certain. If their stalker was monitoring their communications, the coded message would be meaningless. But if any other human forces were in the area, which was unlikely but possible, they would understand that the Chun family was under threat and implementing defensive measures. Meanwhile, Sarah was making final adjustments to their active defense systems. The settlement appeared to have minimal defensive capabilities, but that appearance was carefully crafted. Hidden beneath seemingly innocent agricultural equipment were weapons systems that could engage multiple targets simultaneously. The family's most effective defensive tool, however, was their understanding of how different alien species thought and operated. Marcus had made it his business to study the psychology and tactics of various alien hunters, particularly the Crothry. Crothry were apex predators, which meant they had certain predictable behavioral patterns. They preferred to study their prey extensively before attacking. They typically attacked from positions of overwhelming advantage, and they relied on fear and intimidation as much as physical capabilities. More importantly, Crothry had evolved to hunt prey that followed predictable patterns. Most galactic species had behavioral norms that had been established over millions of years of evolution. When threatened, they responded in ways that their predators had learned to expect and counter. Humans were different. Their evolutionary history had given them an unusual combination of traits that confounded most alien hunters. They could be both aggressive and cautious, logical and emotional, individual and collective, often switching between these modes in ways that seemed random to other species. Movement, David reported. Contact is advancing using thermal masking and what looks like active camouflage. Marcus checked his weapons one final time. He carried a modified plasma rifle that Sarah had improved with human engineering principles, making it more reliable and effective than the standard galactic models. His sidearm was a classic human kinetic weapon, what other species dismissed as primitive projectile technology, but which had proven surprisingly effective in their previous encounters. Remember the plan? Marcus said to his family. We're not trying to win a straight fight. We're trying to survive long enough to make this too costly for whoever sent him. The Crothry assassin's reputation was built on quick, efficient kills. If the Chun family could make the engagement prolonged and expensive, It would go against everything the alien hunter had learned about how contracts should proceed. That alone might be enough to create the kind of psychological pressure that would lead to mistakes. Sarah had positioned herself where she could monitor and control their various automated systems. Her job was to coordinate their technological advantages while making it appear that they were simply lucky or better prepared than expected. David's role was to maintain communications and provide tactical support. Despite his age, he had proven remarkably capable in their previous encounters. His youth actually provided certain advantages. He could think and move in ways that alien hunters, accustomed to dealing with adult opponents, often didn't anticipate. "Contact is within 500 meters, David announced. Maintaining stealth, but our sensors are tracking him through thermal displacement." Marcus felt the familiar calm that came with impending combat. This was what he had been trained for during his years in the Colonial Marines. The weapons might be more advanced, and the enemy might be alien, but the fundamental principles of tactical engagement remain the same. "Sarah, activate the thermal maskers," he ordered. "Let's see how our friend reacts when his prey disappears from his sensors." Throughout the settlement, hidden devices began generating false thermal signatures, creating dozens of human-shaped heat sources that moved through the buildings in seemingly random patterns. To anyone relying on thermal imaging to track the family's movements, it would suddenly appear that the settlement was occupied by far more people than expected. At the same time, the real family members moved to positions where their actual heat signatures will be masked by the settlement's power systems and equipment. Within moments, what had appeared to be 3 isolated targets had become a confusing maze of potential threats and false contacts. This was typical of the Chun family's approach to dealing with alien assassins. Rather than trying to match their attackers' advantages in stealth or firepower, they focused on creating confusion and uncertainty. Most alien hunters were accustomed to having superior information about their targets. When that advantage was removed, they often made mistakes. "Thermal maskers are active," Sarah reported. "He should be seeing approximately 30 human heat signatures distributed throughout the settlement." Marcus nodded approvingly. The psychological impact of this development would be significant. The assassin had been hired to eliminate 3 isolated humans. Suddenly, finding himself facing what appeared to be a much larger force would force him to recalculate his approach. "Contact has stopped moving," David announced. "He's holding position, probably trying to assess the new situation." Perfect. The longer the assassin spent trying to understand what was happening, the more time the Chun family had to prepare their next moves. In warfare, time usually favored the defender, particularly when the defender had better knowledge of the terrain and battlefield conditions. Marcus began moving toward his primary fighting position, a location that would allow him to cover multiple approaches to the settlement, while remaining concealed from most observation points. His years of experience had taught him that the best defensive positions were often not the most obvious ones. As he moved, Marcus reflected on how much his family's situation had changed since they had first arrived on Kepler 442c. They had come seeking peace and isolation, hoping to build a simple life away from the complications of civilized space. Instead, they had been forced to become something unique in the galaxy. Human civilians who fought like soldiers, but thought like engineers. The combination had proven surprisingly effective. They had survived 6 previous assassination attempts, each one more sophisticated than the last. Their success had apparently convinced their enemies to escalate to hiring the galaxy's most feared predator species. But Marcus had studied the Crothery extensively since learning about this latest threat. Like all apex predators, they had certain vulnerabilities that could be exploited by prey that understood their psychology and tactics. The key was to make the hunt more costly and complicated than the Crothery expected. "Contact is moving again," David reported, advancing on the southern perimeter, maintaining stealth protocols. Marcus smiled grimly. The southern approach was where he had hoped their attacker would choose to advance. It appeared to offer the best concealment and multiple infiltration routes, but It was actually the most heavily monitored and defended approach to the settlement. "Sarah, prepare the southern grid for activation," he said. "But wait for my signal. We want him fully committed before we spring any surprises." The next few minutes would determine whether the Chun family's preparations and planning were sufficient to deal with the galaxy's deadliest alien mercenary. They were about to discover that reputation and reality didn't always match, and that humans had their own ways of being dangerous. Zextar crouched behind a cluster of volcanic rocks, his four crimson eyes studying the Chun settlement through his enhanced scope. What he saw made his mandibles click in confusion. According to his thermal imaging, the settlement that should have contained 3 humans now showed over 30 heat signatures moving throughout the buildings. This was not what his intelligence had indicated. Either the Chun family had been joined by reinforcements, or they possessed technology that was more advanced than anyone had reported. Neither possibility was appealing to a hunter who preferred overwhelming advantages and predictable prey. The Crothery assassin cycled through different sensor modes, trying to understand what he was seeing. Electromagnetic scans revealed significant power usage throughout the settlement, far more than would be needed by 3 individuals. Communications intercepts picked up multiple conversations happening simultaneously. Even chemical analysis suggested the presence of numerous humans. Yet something felt wrong. In his centuries of hunting, Zextar had developed instincts that had kept him alive through thousands of successful contracts. Those instincts were now warning him that the situation was not what it appeared to be. He reviewed the intelligence files again, looking for any mention of the Chun family having contact with other human settlements. According to all reports, they were isolated pioneers who had deliberately chosen to live away from other members of their species. It was unlikely that they would suddenly be joined by dozens of allies, which suggested that what he was seeing was some form of deception. The realization was both irritating and impressive. Few species possessed the technological sophistication to create convincing false readings across multiple sensor types simultaneously. Even fewer had the tactical awareness to implement such deception before an attack began. But humans were notorious for their unusual approaches to problem solving. They were one of the few species that seemed to specialize in unconventional solutions to conventional problems. If they were generating false thermal signatures, it demonstrated a level of preparation that suggested they had been expecting professional assassins. Zextar began analyzing the settlement's layout with renewed attention to detail. What he had initially dismissed as simple agricultural buildings now revealed themselves to be far more sophisticated. Hidden weapon emplacements were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Sensor arrays were disguised as farming equipment. Even the placement of livestock pens and storage buildings showed tactical thinking. This was not the home of helpless civilians. It was a fortress designed to look like a farm. The Crothery hunter felt a stirring of something he rarely experienced: respect for his prey. The Chin family had clearly studied their potential enemies and prepared accordingly. They understood that they would face superior firepower and technology, so they had focused on creating advantages in areas where human capabilities could shine. But respect did not diminish his determination to complete the contract. If anything, the discovery that his targets were prepared made the hunt more interesting. Zextar had grown bored with eliminating helpless victims. A prey species that could plan and fight back would provide the kind of challenge that had originally drawn him to the assassination profession. He began developing a new approach based on what he now understood about his targets. The humans had prepared for a conventional assault, but they were still dealing with a Crothery hunter. His species had been perfecting predatory techniques for millions of years. Some advantages could not be overcome through preparation and technology alone. Zextar activated his biological camouflage systems, allowing his chitinous armor to blend seamlessly with the surrounding rock formations. His natural coloration could adapt to almost any environment, making him effectively invisible to most forms of visual detection. Combined with his stealth technology, He could move through the settlement's perimeter without triggering their sensors. The key was patience. Most prey species, when they detected a threat, would either flee immediately or prepare for an immediate assault. Humans had chosen to prepare, which suggested they were confident in their defensive capabilities. That confidence could be turned against them through psychological pressure and extended stalking. Crothery hunting techniques relied heavily on understanding the psychology of their prey. Most species had predictable responses to being hunted. They would seek shelter, call for help, or attempt to drive off the predator through displays of force. These responses had evolved over millions of years and were deeply ingrained in their behavior patterns. Humans were unusual because their evolutionary history had given them multiple survival strategies. They could be aggressive predators when hunting, cooperative social animals when building communities, or individual survivors when faced with overwhelming threats. This flexibility made them unpredictable, but it also meant they could be manipulated if you understood how to trigger specific responses. Zextar began implementing a classic Crothery psychological warfare technique. Rather than attempting to penetrate the settlement's defenses immediately, he would make his presence known in subtle ways that would gradually increase the stress level of his targets. He moved to a new position and activated a device that generated brief, barely detectable energy pulses. The pulses would register on the human sensors as possible threats, but they would be too brief and indistinct to confirm. Over time, the constant low-level alerts would create stress and fatigue that would degrade their judgment and reaction times. From his new position, Zextar could observe the settlement's response patterns. He watched as the thermal signatures moved in what appeared to be defensive formations. The humans were clearly experienced in tactical thinking, but they were still operating according to recognizable military protocols. Military training was both a strength and a weakness. It provided discipline and coordination that civilian targets lacked, but it also created predictable behavior patterns. Soldiers were trained to respond to threats in specific ways, and those responses could be anticipated and countered by someone who understood military thinking. Through his scope, Zextar finally caught a glimpse of one of his actual targets. Marcus Chun appeared briefly in a window before moving away, but it was enough for the Crothery to assess his physical condition and demeanor. The human male moved with the controlled alertness of someone with significant combat experience, but he also showed signs of stress that suggested the psychological pressure was beginning to work. Excellent. Zextar began planning his next move. Meanwhile, inside the settlement, Marcus Chun was reaching similar conclusions about his stalker's capabilities and intentions. The brief energy pulses registering on their sensors were too regular to be natural phenomena, but too weak to indicate an immediate attack. Someone was testing their defenses and trying to wear down their alertness through psychological pressure. Classic predator behavior, Marcus told his family as they reviewed the sensor data. Our friend out there is trying to make us nervous and tired before he makes his real move. It's actually a good sign. It means he's taking us seriously as opponents. Sarah looked up from her monitoring station. How long can he maintain this kind of pressure? As long as he wants, Marcus admitted. Crothery are known for their patience. They can stalk prey for weeks if necessary. But that cuts both ways. We know where he is, and every hour he spends out, there is another hour for us to prepare surprises for him. David had been studying everything available about Crothery hunting techniques since they had identified their stalker. According to the databases, Crothery hunters typically try to isolate their prey from support networks and safe spaces. He's probably expecting us to either flee or make some kind of aggressive move. Marcus nodded approvingly. His son's tactical analysis was becoming increasingly sophisticated, right? So we do neither. We stay put, we stay alert, and we let him make the first mistake. The Chun family's defensive strategy was based on a fundamental understanding of human advantages in asymmetric warfare. They couldn't match a Crothery's physical capabilities or advanced technology, but they could outthink him by using human psychological and tactical flexibility. Humans had spent most of their evolutionary history as persistence hunters and problem solvers. They were exceptionally good at finding creative solutions to seemingly impossible challenges. More importantly, they were willing to use tactics that other species might consider irrational or dishonorable. "Sarah, how are our special project coming along?" Marcus asked. Sarah smiled in a way that would have worried any alien who understood human expressions. "The kinetic surprises are ready for deployment, and I've finished calibrating the sonic disruptors. I also managed to complete that little psychological project we discussed." The psychological project was one of Sarah's more creative contributions to their defense plan. She had studied recordings of Crothry vocalizations and identified the specific sound frequencies that their species used to communicate dominance and submission. By broadcasting modified versions of these sounds, they could potentially trigger instinctive responses in their attacker. "David, what's our communication status?" Marcus continued. "All channels are clear and monitored," David reported. "No backup is available, but I've set up automated distress signals that will activate if our perimeter is breached. If this goes badly, at least other human settlements will know what happened." Marcus felt a surge of pride in his family's competence and courage. They were facing one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators with nothing but their intelligence, preparation, and determination to protect each other. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that humans seem to specialize in surviving. "All right," Marcus said. "Let's show our friend what happens when he tries to hunt humans who know they're being hunted." The next phase of their defensive plan involved turning the psychological warfare back against their attacker. Rather than simply enduring the Crothry's attempts to wear them down, they would begin implementing their own psychological pressure tactics. Sarah activated a series of devices positioned throughout the valley that began generating subsonic frequencies specifically calibrated to interfere with Crothry hearing. The sounds were too low for humans to detect, but they would create discomfort and disorientation for their stalker. At the same time, David began broadcasting false radio transmissions that suggested the settlement was in contact with human military forces. The transmissions were carefully crafted to sound authentic, while providing misleading information about response times and available support. Marcus moved to implement the most dangerous part of their plan. Rather than waiting for the Crothry to choose the time and place of engagement, he was going to force the confrontation by making himself visible as bait. The strategy was risky, but it was based on solid understanding of predator psychology. Crothry hunters were accustomed to controlling the pace and terms of their hunts. When prey began taking aggressive action, it often triggered instinctive responses that could override tactical thinking. Marcus positioned himself in what appeared to be a vulnerable location near the settlement's perimeter. He made sure to move in ways that would be clearly visible to anyone watching from the surrounding hills. To an observer, it would appear that one of the humans was either careless or attempting to flee. The bait was set. Now they would discover whether a Crothry hunter could resist the temptation of what appeared to be an easy target. Zextar observed the human male's movements through his scope, his mandibles clicking with anticipation. After hours of careful stalking and psychological pressure, one of his targets was finally making a mistake. The human appeared to be attempting to reach some kind of hidden vehicle or escape route, moving in patterns that exposed him to observation and potential attack. This was exactly the kind of behavior Zextar had been trying to provoke. Prey animals, under stress, eventually made poor decisions that provided hunting opportunities. The human's movement patterns showed all the signs of panic and desperation that marked a successful psychological assault. But something about the situation still felt wrong. The human's movements were erratic, but they weren't completely random. There was a pattern to his behavior that suggested either incredible luck or deliberate planning. More troubling, the subsonic frequencies that had been affecting Zextar's hearing were making it difficult to maintain complete awareness of his surroundings. Still, the opportunity was too good to pass up. Zextar had built his reputation on recognizing and exploiting moments of prey vulnerability. If he allowed excessive caution to prevent him from acting, he might lose his chance for a quick resolution to this contract. The Crothry hunter began moving toward an attack position, using his natural camouflage and technological stealth to remain undetected. His plan was to eliminate the exposed human quickly, then use the psychological shock of losing a family member to break the defensive resolve of the remaining targets. It was a proven technique that had worked countless times before against dozens of different species. Humans might be more creative and flexible than most prey, but they were still social animals who formed emotional attachments. The loss of the family's primary protector would devastate their ability to continue organized resistance. Zextar reached a position within striking range of his target and began charging his plasma rifle. In seconds, he would end this hunt and collect his fee. The reputation of the galaxy's deadliest alien mercenary would remain intact. What he didn't realize was that Marcus Chun had spent the last 2 hours positioning himself exactly where the Crothry hunter could not resist attacking from. Every movement had been calculated to draw the alien predator to this specific location at this specific time. The trap was about to be sprung. Zextar raised his plasma rifle, targeting the apparently vulnerable human moving through the settlement's perimeter. His 4 eyes tracked Marcus Chin's movements with predatory focus as he prepared to end this hunt with a single, decisive shot. The Crothry's finger began to apply pressure to the weapon's trigger mechanism. The explosion that erupted beneath his feet launched Zextar 15 meters through the air before he even registered what had happened. Sarah Chin's carefully placed kinetic mines had been triggered by pressure sensors that detected the specific weight and movement patterns of a large alien predator. The blast wasn't intended to kill immediately. It was designed to disorient and damage while leaving the target alive enough to experience what came next. Zextar crashed into a cluster of rocks, his chitinous armor cracked, and his plasma rifle shattered. Multiple fractures ran through his exoskeleton, and green blood seeped from various injuries. But he was alive, conscious, and now fully aware that he had been manipulated into a trap. The realization brought with it a sensation that Zextar had never experienced before: genuine fear. In over 3,000 successful contracts, he had never encountered prey that had been able to turn the tables on him so completely. The humans had not only detected his approach, but had predicted his actions accurately enough to position explosive devices precisely where he would choose to attack. Now you understand. Marcus Chin's voice echoed across the valley through hidden speakers, speaking in accented galactic standard. You came here expecting to hunt helpless prey. Instead, you found humans who know how to fight back. Zextar struggled to his feet, his enhanced healing systems already working to repair the damage from the explosion. But he could tell that his natural advantages had been severely compromised. His stealth systems were damaged, his primary weapon was destroyed, and his physical condition was degraded. More troubling was the psychological impact of the trap. Crothry psychology was built around the concept of overwhelming superiority over their prey. The sudden reversal of roles, from hunter to hunted, was creating a level of stress that his species was not evolved to handle. You're probably wondering how 3 humans on a frontier world managed to outmaneuver the galaxy's most feared assassin. Marcus continued, his voice coming from multiple directions as he moved between broadcasting points. The answer is simple. You made the mistake of underestimating what humans can accomplish when they're fighting for their family. Through his damaged scope, Zextar caught glimpses of a human family moving through their settlement with military precision. They were no longer trying to hide their capabilities. Marcus Chun carried a modified plasma rifle that appeared to be more advanced than anything in Zextar's arsenal. Sarah Chun was coordinating multiple technical systems with the efficiency of a combat engineer. Even their offspring moved with tactical awareness that rivaled experienced soldiers. You studied our species, didn't you? Sarah Chin's voice joined the conversation. You read our files, analyzed our weaknesses, planned your approach based on what you thought you understood about human capabilities. But you made the same mistake that every alien hunter makes. You assume that humans are just another prey species. Zextar activated his backup weapons systems, drawing molecular disruptors and preparing to fight his way out of the valley. But as he moved, more explosions erupted around him, not close enough to cause additional damage, but positioned to demonstrate that his movements were being tracked and anticipated. "We're not prey," Davidson added, his young voice carrying a confidence that unsettled the Crothery hunter. "We're persistent predators who learn to hunt in packs across impossible terrain. We survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and natural disasters that would have exterminated most species. And now we survive by being smarter than aliens who think evolution gave them all the advantages." The psychological warfare was working. Zextar could feel his tactical thinking becoming clouded by emotions that his species rarely experienced. Fear, confusion, and something approaching respect for his targets were interfering with his ability to process information and plan effective responses. He tried to retreat to a more defensible position, but discovered that the entire valley was now actively hostile to his presence. Hidden sensors tracked his movements. Automated weapons systems targeted him with precision fire that herded him away from any potential cover, and the subsonic frequencies that had been bothering him earlier were now causing significant discomfort. "You want to know the real difference between Crothery and humans?" Marcus asked, his voice now coming from a single direction as he approached Zextar's position. "You evolved to be perfect killers in stable environments with predictable prey. We evolved to be adaptable problem solvers who could survive anything the universe threw at us." Zextar could see Marcus Chun now, moving through the rocky terrain with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his environment. The human carried his weapon with professional competence, but he moved with the confidence of someone who knew the battlefield better than his opponent. That means when you came here expecting a routine assassination, you encountered a family that had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this kind of threat. Marcus continued. "Every previous attack taught us something about alien hunting techniques. Every failure by our enemies made us stronger and more prepared. The Crothery hunter attempted to use his remaining technological advantages, activating a personal shield generator and firing his molecular disruptors. But the humans had clearly studied his species' standard equipment. The weapon's fire was absorbed by defensive barriers that materialized from concealed positions, while electromagnetic pulses disabled his shield systems. Sarah, disable his communication array." Marcus called to his wife. A precisely targeted energy beam from the settlement destroyed Zextar's remaining communication equipment, cutting him off from any potential support or extraction. He was now completely isolated in hostile territory, facing opponents who seemed to anticipate his every move. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Zextar had gone from confident predator to desperate survivor in less than 10 minutes. His reputation, his self-image, and his understanding of his place in the galactic hierarchy were all crumbling as he faced the reality that humans were far more dangerous than anyone had realized. "You probably think this is about revenge," Sarah said, her voice now broadcasting from her position near the settlement's main buildings. "But it's not. It's about sending a message to whoever hired you and anyone else who thinks they can threaten human families." Zextar realized that his only remaining option was direct confrontation. His stealth capabilities were compromised, his advanced weapons were destroyed or disabled, and his tactical position was hopeless. But he was still a Crothery warrior with natural weapons and centuries of combat experience. He charged toward Marcus Chen's position, relying on his species' natural speed and strength to overcome the humans' technological advantages. For a moment, it seemed like the direct approach might succeed. His chitinous claws extended as he closed the distance to his target. Marcus didn't retreat. Instead, he did something that no Crothery had ever encountered in millions of years of hunting. He moved forward to meet the charge head-on. The collision between human and alien was brief, but decisive. Zextar's natural weapons met Marcus's modified armor and kinetic amplification systems in a clash that sent both combatants staggering backward. But when the dust settled, it was the Crothry who was down, his exoskeleton further cracked, and his movements severely impaired. "Impossible," Zextar gasped, green blood flowing from new wounds. "Humans are weak. Soft. You cannot match Crothry in direct combat." Marcus stood over the fallen alien, his weapon trained on Zextar's center mass. "You're right about human physical limitations. In a fair fight between our species, you would probably win. But this isn't a fair fight. Fair fights are for species that can afford them." He gestured to the settlement around them, with its hidden weapons, concealed barriers, and technological systems that had turned a peaceful valley into a death trap for alien predators. "Humans don't believe in fair fights when our families are threatened," Marcus continued. "We believe in using every advantage we can create, every tool we can build, and every tactical innovation we can develop to ensure that our loved ones survive." Zextar attempted to reach for a backup weapon, but found his movements anticipated once again. Sarah Chun had flanked his position and now held him under the sights of her own rifle. "The question now," Sarah said, "is what we do with you. We could kill you, but that would just convince your employers to send more assassins. We could hold you prisoner, but we're not equipped for long-term detention of a Crothry." David Chun appeared from another direction, completing the tactical encirclement of their former hunter. "Or we could send you back with a message." Zextar looked around at the three humans who had so completely outmaneuvered him. Despite his injuries and defeat, he found himself studying their tactical coordination and wondering how they had achieved such effectiveness with seemingly primitive resources. "What message?" he asked, his voice weak from blood loss and shock. Marcus Chun knelt down beside the wounded alien, bringing himself to Zextar's eye level. "You tell whoever hired you that this family is under human protection now. You tell them that attacking us means war with a species that specializes in impossible victories against overwhelming odds." He paused, making sure the Crothry understood the seriousness of his words. "And you tell every other alien mercenary in the galaxy that hunting humans is not like hunting any other prey. We don't run. We don't surrender. We don't accept defeat. We learn from every attack. We adapt to every threat. And we turn every attempt to harm our families into a lesson about why human beings are the most dangerous species in the galaxy when you threaten what we love." Zextar stared at the human faces surrounding him, finally beginning to understand what he had encountered. These weren't just three random civilians who had gotten lucky against a superior predator. They were representatives of a species that had turned survival into an art form and warfare into a science. "I have killed over 3,000 beings across 47 worlds," Zextar said, his voice filled with something approaching awe. "I have never encountered any prey species that could do what you have done." Marcus stood up, his expression softening slightly. "That's because you've never hunted humans before. We're not like other species. We don't accept our place in the food chain. When something tries to hunt us, we hunt it back." The Crothry assassin felt the truth of those words settling into his consciousness like a physical weight. Everything he had believed about his own superiority, about the natural order of predator and prey, about the dominance of evolved hunters over primitive species, all of it had been shattered by three humans on a frontier world. "What happens now?" Zextar asked. Sarah Chun checked her medical scanner and shook her head. "Now we patch you up enough to survive, give you a ship, and send you home. But first, you're going to record a message for your employers and any other aliens who might be considering similar contracts." The message would be simple but effective. Hunting humans was not like hunting any other species. It was a quick way to discover that the galaxy's so-called primitive newcomers had their own ways of being deadly. 3 weeks later, Zextar sat in a medical facility on Nexus Station, his exoskeleton slowly regenerating from the injuries sustained during his encounter with the Chin family. The Crothry healing process was efficient, but it would be months before he was fully recovered. The physical damage, however, was nothing compared to the psychological transformation he had undergone. The recorded message he had transmitted upon returning to civilization had spread throughout the galactic Mercenary network within hours. the galaxy's most feared assassin, admitting defeat at the hands of 3 humans on a frontier world, describing tactics and capabilities that no one had previously attributed to the newcomer species. The reaction had been swift and varied. Some alien hunters dismissed his account as impossible or the result of some kind of mental breakdown. Others began studying human settlements with new interest, looking for signs of the defensive sophistication that Zextar described. A few experienced mercenaries quietly removed all human contract from their available assignments. The Zolonian merchant who had hired him was less understanding. The squid-like alien had raged about the failed contract, demanding explanations and threatening legal action. Zextar had simply transferred the recording of his encounter and waited for the merchant to understand the implications. When the full scope of human defensive capabilities became clear, the Zolonian's anger had turned to fear. If 3 humans on an isolated world could defeat the galaxy's most dangerous assassin, what could entire human colonies accomplish? What kind of military response would humanity mount if alien criminal organizations continued targeting their civilians? The merchant had quietly withdrawn all claims against the Chun family and abandoned plans for mining operations in their system. Other criminal enterprises that had been considering similar actions against human settlements began reassessing their strategies. But for Zextar, the professional implications were secondary to the personal revelation he had experienced. In defeating him, the Chun family had not just protected themselves. They had forced him to confront fundamental assumptions about his own nature and place in the galaxy. He had spent centuries believing that evolutionary superiority granted automatic dominance over lesser species. The Crothri were apex predators, perfectly evolved killing machines that sat at the top of the galactic food chain. Everything he had learned about biology, psychology, and warfare supported this belief. Humans had shattered that certainty in a single encounter. They had demonstrated that intelligence, creativity, and determination could overcome millions of years of evolutionary advantage. More importantly, they had shown that cooperation and mutual protection could create capabilities that exceeded the sum of individual strengths. The Chun family had not defeated him through superior technology or overwhelming force. They had won by understanding their enemy better than their enemy understood them, by preparing more thoroughly than their opponent expected, and by fighting with a level of tactical coordination that transformed individual weakness into collective strength. As Zextar recovered, he found himself studying everything available about human history and culture. What he discovered was a species unlike any other in the galaxy, one that had survived and thrived not through evolutionary perfection, but through adaptability and innovation. Humans had evolved on a world that had tried to kill them in every possible way. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, plagues, predators, climate changes. Their home planet had subjected them to constant existential threats that would have driven most species to extinction. Instead of developing specialized survival traits like most successful species, humans had learned to survive through intelligence, cooperation, and the ability to rapidly adapt to changing conditions. When they reached space, they brought these survival instincts with them. Human colonies weren't just settlements. They were examples of a species that instinctively prepared for any threat the universe might present. The Chun family's fortress-like home was not unusual among human pioneers. It was standard procedure for a species that had learned never to assume they were safe. More disturbing was what Zextar learned about human military capabilities. The files available to civilian researchers were limited, but they suggested that human armed forces operated according to principles that most galactic civilizations found incomprehensible. They specialized in victory against superior opponents, asymmetric warfare, and tactical innovations that turned apparent disadvantages into strategic strengths. If 3 civilian humans could defeat a Crothri assassin, what could trained human soldiers accomplish? The question haunted Zextar as he considered his future. His reputation as the galaxy's deadliest mercenary was effectively destroyed. Few clients would hire someone who had been defeated by the species they were supposed to eliminate. Even those who believed his account of human capabilities would question whether he remained effective after such a psychological blow. But Zextar was beginning to realize that his reputation had been built on a lie. He had not been the galaxy's deadliest mercenary. He had been the galaxy's most successful bully, targeting species that lacked the ability or willingness to fight back effectively. When he finally encountered prey that could match his capabilities, he had been completely outclassed. The humans had taught him that true strength was not about evolutionary advantages or advanced technology. It was about the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect what you valued most. The Chin family had been willing to spend years preparing for threats they might never face, to transform their peaceful home into a fortress, to risk their lives in direct combat against a superior opponent, all because they refused to allow anyone to threaten their family. That kind of dedication and sacrifice was something Zextar had never encountered in his long career as an assassin. Most species, when faced with overwhelming threats, would either flee or surrender. They would make rational calculations about survival odds and choose the option that offered the best chance of preserving their individual lives. Humans seem to operate according to different principles entirely. They would fight impossible battles if the alternative was losing something they loved. They would sacrifice personal safety for the protection of others. They would choose death before dishonor, defeat before surrender. These were not the characteristics of prey animals. They were the traits of a warrior species that happened to look deceptively vulnerable. As Zextar's recovery progressed, he began receiving visits from other members of the galactic mercenary community. Most came seeking details about his encounter with the humans, hoping to learn something that would help them avoid a similar fate. A few offered partnerships or employment, recognizing that his experience with human tactics might be valuable. But the most interesting visitor was an elderly Crothry female named HFY, a former military strategist who had spent decades studying interspecies warfare. She listened to Zextar's account with the focused attention of someone who understood the implications of what she was hearing. "You have encountered something unprecedented," she told him after reviewing his complete report. "A prey species that has learned to hunt its hunters. This changes everything we thought we understood about the galactic balance of power." HFY had access to classified military intelligence that revealed the full scope of human expansion throughout the galaxy. In just a few decades since achieving faster-than-light travel, humans had established colonies in over 200 systems. Their settlements were appearing faster than most governments could track, and each one seemed to be designed with defensive capabilities that exceeded anything previously seen from civilian populations. "They're not just colonizing planets," HFY explained. "They are creating a network of mutually supporting fortresses that could serve as the foundation for a military alliance unlike anything the galaxy has ever seen. Each settlement is both a colony and a fortress. Each family is both civilians and soldiers." The implications were staggering. If humans continued expanding at their current rate while maintaining their defensive preparations, they would become a major galactic power within generations. More troubling was the question of what would happen when other species tried to stop that expansion through military action. "Your encounter with the Chun family may have been more significant than you realized," HFY continued. "You may have provided us with our first clear view of human military potential. If 3 civilians could defeat you, what could their actual military forces accomplish?" Zextar had been wondering the same thing. Marcus Chin's tactical skills and equipment had been impressive, but they were supposedly those of a former soldier who had chosen civilian life. What capabilities did active-duty human military personnel possess? "There are rumors," HFY said quietly, "that several minor species have already attempted to claim human-settled worlds through military action. According to the reports, those attempts were unsuccessful." She provided access to intelligence files that painted a disturbing picture. Human colonies that appeared to be defended by nothing more than civilian militia had somehow repelled attacks by organized military forces. Alien invasion fleets had been destroyed or driven off by settlers using improvised weapons, and tactics that defied conventional military wisdom. The pattern was consistent and alarming. Humans did not fight like any other species. They did not accept defeat, even when faced with overwhelming odds. They turned every battle into a learning experience that made them more effective in the next encounter. "What are you suggesting?" Zextar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I am suggesting that your failed assassination attempt may have been the galaxy's first clear warning about what humanity represents," HFY replied. "A species that has turned survival into an art form and warfare into a science. A people who see every threat as an opportunity to become stronger." She paused, studying Zextar's scarred exoskeleton with professional interest. "The question now is what we do with that knowledge. Do we warn other species about human capabilities? Do we attempt to establish peaceful relations before they become too powerful to oppose? Or do we try to eliminate them while they are still relatively few in number?" Zextar considered the options, remembering the calm determination he had seen in the Chun family's faces as they outmaneuvered and defeated him. The idea of attempting to eliminate humanity through military action seemed both futile and terrifying. "I think," he said slowly, "that anyone who tries to hunt humans will discover what I learned on Kepler 442c. They're not prey. They are predators who learn to look harmless until it was too late to escape." HFY nodded approvingly. "A wise conclusion. Perhaps it would be better to learn how to coexist with them rather than testing their defensive capabilities further." As their conversation ended, Zextar reflected on how completely his worldview had changed since his encounter with the Chun family. He had entered their valley as the galaxy's most feared predator and emerged as someone who understood that true danger often came disguised as vulnerability. The humans had taught him that evolution was not destiny, that intelligence could overcome instinct, and that the most dangerous opponents were often those who appear to be the weakest. They had shown him that a family fighting to protect each other could accomplish things that individual warriors could never achieve. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that humanity was not just another species to be cataloged and dismissed. They were something new in the galaxy, a people who had learned to turn every disadvantage into an advantage, every attack into a lesson, every threat into an opportunity to become more dangerous. Zextar made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He officially retired from the assassination profession and began offering his services as a consultant on human defensive capabilities. If other aliens were going to encounter humanity, they deserved to understand what they were facing. His first piece of advice was always the same: never hunt humans. They hunt back. The message was spreading throughout the galaxy, carried by mercenaries, traders, and military strategists who had heard the account of the Crothery who had learned to fear his prey. Some listened and adapted their strategies accordingly. Others dismissed the warnings as the delusions of a broken predator. But on frontier worlds throughout human space, families like the Chins continued their quiet preparations, turning their homes into fortresses and their children into soldiers. They were creating a civilization that could protect itself against any threat the galaxy might present. The age of humans as helpless prey was ending. The age of humans as apex predators had begun.